Welcome back, guys. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and we're now in lesson 2 for girding for war. In the last lesson, we talked about whether it was about states' rights or slavery, and we talked about that very first battle in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, actually Charleston, South Carolina. Look at this first slide. We have here of the United States, and this map is of the northern states that are pink are with the Union. The southern states that are green are with the Confederacy. The dark pink states are border states, and Oklahoma that have slaves, and Oklahoma is not yet a state, but it has slaves. And then the orange are not states at all at this point. And so you can see that the United States is divided pretty cleanly, north against south. So looking at the next slide, it says logistics. After that first battle, in which South Carolina bombards Fort Sumter for 30 hours, and it's American soldiers, and the American soldiers surrender. Now, what do? We have the CSA, or the Confederate States of America, fighting against the United States. And they both now have to face some harsh realities. Look at the next slide. CSA weaknesses. Supplies is the first one. How do you feed troops? How do you feed soldiers in a part of the country where pretty much the only thing they grow is tobacco and cotton? Now, sure, they grow other kinds of food, but they also import food from outside of the South. And so at this point, how do you feed all those troops when your fields mostly grow tobacco and cotton? You have to figure that out. How do you transport? How do you move them from here to here in a place that didn't have a lot of roads and railroads? How do you move not just the men, but the supplies, the food? How do you move the clothing? How do you move the cannon? How do you move everything? Because the South doesn't have a lot of roads and doesn't have a lot of railroads. They don't have any navy. And they don't have a whole lot of money. And each state believes that their money should be different. So South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, all these states, they believe they should have the ability to have different kinds of money. They don't in the end, because part of the solution was to have one currency, like the United States had one currency. But there's lots of weaknesses and lots of problems that they have to figure out. Now look at the next slide. United States of America weaknesses. They also have weaknesses, not nearly as many. How do you fight a war with only 16,000 soldiers? Many of the soldiers left for the Confederacy. But keep this in mind, the Confederacy doesn't have as many people, and we're going to look at that in just a little bit as well, at the number of people. 1/3 of all the officers in the United States joined the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee is the most important of these. Robert E. Lee was one of the best generals in American history. If he had fought for the North, the war would have ended much sooner. And the United States didn't have a strong president. All the presidents, because of slavery, because they were afraid to take a stand on slavery, the presidents since the 1840s have been pretty weak. The next slide, it says finance. The government began issuing bonds, which means they will go to the people or large companies and say, give us a loan and we'll pay you back with interest. So if you give us one loan for $1,000, in 2 years, we'll give you $1,100 back, as an example. And this, one of the solutions was, well, if we don't have enough money, just print more money. We just print it. We can make the money. Let's just print more. But if you have more money, then what happens? The prices of things go up, and it just doesn't work. And so both the United States and the Confederacy initially, in the beginning, printed more. So the next slide, the North versus the South are kind of comparing these two financially. By 1864, the United States government has spent all of its money and is in massive debt. The South is suspicious of a strong government, and they collect some taxes, but they're also weaker, very weak financially. Politically, the North has a strong leader in Abraham Lincoln for the first time in a long time, but so does the South. They have a strong leader in President Jeff Davis. Militarily, Northern men do not want to fight at first because they don't understand, why are they fighting? What is this war over for them? Is it over slavery? And Southern men were inspired to fight. They felt invaded because much of this war takes place in the South, not in the North. If you look at the next slide, we see on the left side of this picture, we see President Jeff Davis. He's the president of the Confederacy. And on the right side, we see President Abraham Lincoln. He's the president of the United States. Now, Jeff Davis was from Mississippi, and he'd been a U.S. government official during the war. In fact, he was a United States senator when the war began. On the next slide, we see a map, and even though we saw a similar map before, I now want to talk about some of the things that we see on this map. Certainly, we have the dark blue in the top and the west that fight with the United States, and the red on the bottom that fight with the Confederacy. But what you'll also notice is we have some light blue states, and there should be 5 of them. And you're going to see on the right side of that map, it's a little bit hard to make out, but that first one is Missouri on the left side. Well, it's kind of in the middle of the map, but it's on the far left of the 5 that are light blue. That's Missouri. Now, Missouri is a slave state. To Missouri's left, we see Kansas. And if you remember in a previous lesson, we talked about Kansas, and Kansas initially voted to become slave, but ultimately Kansas outlawed slavery. And so by the Civil War, Kansas does not have slaves, but Missouri has slaves. Then we move a little bit to the right, just above Tennessee, and we see Kentucky, and Kentucky has slaves. And then we move just a little bit to the right again, and we see West Virginia, and it's not labeled as West Virginia, but West Virginia has slaves. West Virginia wasn't even a state. It was part of Virginia, but it split off of Virginia because it did not want to leave the United States. And then we have just above Virginia where it kind of comes to a point and you can barely see just a narrow band up there. We have Maryland, and then just along the coast we have Delaware. These 5 states were slave states, but they fought with the United States, not with the Confederacy. All of the states in the South that are pink, they were slave states. All of the dark blue, they were not slave states. So we have these 5 states here in the middle that are slave states, but are fighting for the United States against the Confederacy. Now look at the next slide. We see kind of 2 columns here, and on the left side we see Confederate States of America, and on the right side we see the United States of America. But look at the population. The Confederacy has only 5.4 million free people, 3.5 million slaves, whereas the United States has 22 million and 450,000 slaves. So why does this war last so long? The South isn't letting African Americans fight. They have 1/4 the number, 25% of the number of the United States. The United States should have been able to defeat them so much more quickly. The Confederacy has 11 states, while the United States has 23 states. The Confederacy has all slave states, no free states, whereas, of course, the United States, we just talked about, has 4 and 5 slave states when West Virginia separates from Virginia. So why does the South make this war last so long? Well, Robert E. Lee is one answer to that. He's a good general, and the North didn't have very good generals. Another answer to that is because people in the South, this is where the war is. And if your home is invaded, you fight so much harder. The United States, they were not invaded. They went south and attacked the southern states. And maybe they fought with less desire than people in the South were fighting. That's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to continue to talk about the Civil War, And we'll probably be talking about that for the next couple of chapters. So, all right, we'll see you then. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.